Greetings, my fellow free and blooded sovereign thinkers. This is LL3's newest podcast. My name is Craig, transmitting from the beautiful swampy mangroves of South Florida. And today's date, Saturday, June 10th, 2017. The rain keeps coming. Now it looks like it's going to be more clouds. It'll be scattered. But so, just how it is. Hopefully everyone out in the western part of South Florida, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties are safe, because I know a lot of areas have been flooded. And so hang in there, hope for the best, make it work, because I know you can. I'm at CJ's Java Lounge, located at 400 Southwest 1st Avenue along the New River of Fort Lauderdale. They had a little show last night. It was like more of a jam. This person named Charlie Sullivan. And it was entertaining. A lot of cover songs. People got into it. I gotta say, it was a pleasant atmosphere. So when you have a chance, come on down. I know they're open from 7 to 5 from Monday to Thursdays, and 7 to 7 from Friday to Saturday. So Sunday to Thursday, once again, 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. and on Friday, Saturday, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. unless further notice. Hey, more people show up here, the longer they can stay open. All right, so support your mom and pop facilities. Shop locally to solve the economy. Man, so I was still doing this whole thing with Comey, the Trump Russian investigation. Of course, I love it when Dianne Feinstein goes, they should focus on obstruction of justice. And you're hearing from a woman who's been a senator for 30 years, is really fantastic at that particular subject. Love obstructing your freedoms, creating illegal, treasonous laws or referendums that become law. So, you better be careful what you say, Senator Feinstein, because you're good at putting the foot in your mouth when you least expect it. Well, I will say this. Let the chips fall. I still say it's a distraction. But had a good discussion with a couple people. We had a agree, disagree, but it's all good faith about the whole Trump thing. But he does agree, too, about the attack on Iran. We should not meddle in other nations' affairs. So that's a good thing. So bring all our troops home, including this covert CIA and all our brothers that are serving. These proxy wars. Bring them home. And all those politicians that think we should attack these countries, you go on the front line. Let's see how tough you really are. I know I'm digressing, but that's okay. Well, this episode I'm going to be mainly talking about Libya, based on a 3-part series. I know I did part 1, but I'm going to redo it because it became a 3-part series on the humanitarian destruction of Libya. And it's by Bass Phillip. And he did all 3. And this one came out on May 30th. I believe I've done it before. I've done it before, but I'm going to revamp it, re-narrate it, and get to the other chapters as well, because this is essential. What imperialism can do to a nation. And the order, one world order, don't give a damn about them as an example to the rest of humanity. So, this is what it says here. This is a NewsBud exclusive. And I am a member of the NewsBud community. And the site, everything I'm going to talk about would be mainly on NewsBud. So, if you haven't subscribed, I recommend you do. They're fair, non-biased, and have great amount of merit. So so please support this organization. I will stay here, starts here. This is part one of the humanitarian destruction of Libya, real and invented war crimes. This article is part of a three-part series called The Humanitarian Destruction of Libya that analyzes the 2011 war in Libya and the motives behind it. The first article contrasts the invented war crimes allegations against the Libyan government to the very unreported war crimes by the insurgents. The second exposes the history of a deceptive terrorist attack on European soil wrongly attributed to Gaddafi and the role of NATO in the war. And the third discusses Gaddafi's plan at creating a Pan-African currency as one of the central motives lurking behind the mainstream explanation of the intervention, just as the one that sought to protect civilians from a ruthless dictator. Hopefully you folks out there recall when Barack Obama called it a humanitarian mission. And all those folks in the room that worship Obama didn't say a word. But they're the same individuals that were bloodthirsty of getting rid of Bush and Cheney for the war in Iraq. I questioned one of them on it. Couldn't refute it. He didn't want to talk about it. Why? If you're against the Iraq war, you should have condemned this conflagration as well. So, I am going to start. On 21st February 2011, a week into the Libyan uprising, the International Federation for Human Rights and the Libyan League for Human Rights, two main sources for the claim that Gaddafi was killing his own people, called for the immediate suspension of Libya from the UN Human Rights Council and urged the UN Security Council to review the situation and consider its referral to the ICC, which is the International Criminal Court. According to the two NGOs, the crackdown has at least 300 to 400 people since February 15th, and the Libyan regime is apparently using mercenaries from Chad, Niger, and Zimbabwe. Later that day, UN Watch, a pro-Israel NGO, initiated a letter signed by 70 and other NGO collaboration with the LLHR and the National Endowment for Democracy. And just to let you know, the LLHR is the Libyan League for Human Rights. So it's an acronym. I should have wrote that in there too. And just to give you another one, FIDH, which is the International Federation for Human Rights. That's the acronym for them. Okay, so I should have addressed that before. But I will continue on. Infamous for its involvement in manipulating elections and instigating color revolutions around the world, in which to echoed the need to suspend Libya from the Human Rights Council, in addition to urging the Security Council to invoke the responsibility to protect principle to protect the Libyan people. On 25th February, the Human Rights Council filed a recommendation thereby preventing the Libyan government from countering the undocumented allegations, let alone demanding that proof be submitted. 3 weeks later, the Security Council adopted Resolutions 1970 and 1973, authorizing a no-fly zone on Libyan military aviation. Although Article 2 of Resolution 1973 stressed the need to use diplomacy to find a peaceful solution, the bombing began 2 days later. The public was told that NATO went into Libya because the American, British, and French officials felt the dire need to protect civilians from a brutal dictator. They sought legitimization for their modern version of for the just war, in theory, and a responsibility to protect doctrine. Philosophers and political thinkers have been debating if and when war is morally justifiable for centuries. But it was only in recent time that the idea gained a modern legal dimension above that of the sovereign nation state. A commission set up under the auspices of the Canadian government in 2001 postulated that if a state is unable to halt or avert serious harm to its population, the international community has a responsibility to protect, just like the just war, the Theoreticins. The commission argued that military intervention is justified if a strict set of criteria, having the right intention, military measures being the last resort, and the principle of proportionality, among others, are applicable, adding that there is no better or more appropriate body than the United Nations Security Council to authorize military intervention for human protection services. In 2004, a panel set up by the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan confirmed that there is a collective international responsibility to protect exercisable by the Security Council, authorizing military intervention as the last resort. In the event of genocide and other large-scale killings, ethnic cleansing, and other serious violations of humanitarian law, which sovereign governments have proved powerless or unwilling to prevent. From 2005 onwards, the responsibility to protect doctrine was up and running, and it was endorsed by all matter states of the General Assembly at that year's UN World Summit. So looks like they're just trying to make some excuses and in theory without any proven concrete fact. So I will proceed. Made up war crimes. During Israel's onslaught on Gaza in 2008, in which hundreds of civilians were killed, or any of the subsequent attacks on the coastal enclave, the UN Security Council did not even think about the responsibility to protect, but when allegations that Gaddafi was killing his own people were floating in early 2011, the world body did not hesitate to invoke it, although the necessity of seeking adequate verification of facts before authorizing military intervention resonated through all the above-mentioned documents. The UK, France, and the US bombed Libya on the basis of undocumented allegations provided by NGOs in the first 3 months of NATO's intervention, using only the Security Council resolution as legal justification. So, kind of, sort of, is right. It was only in late June that the ICC issued a warrant for the arrest of Gaddafi, proclaiming the Libyan leader to be guilty of crimes against humanity. At the ICC's press conference following the verdict, a reporter asked Chief Prosecutor Luis Moreno Ocampo for concrete evidence proving Gaddafi's guilt, after which Moreno Ocampo referred to a document, most of which is public. The document is indeed public. The whole section in which the proof is enumerated, comprising about 2/3 of the document, however, is not. Assumption woman! Exactly. Madam Assumptuous. And you're hearing a blower in the back. As Professor Maximilian Forte concluded in his book, Slashing Towards Sirte. The justification of intervention was based on 3 main interlinked myths. 1, the African mercenaries were employed by Gaddafi. 2, that these mercenaries were flown in from other African countries by Gaddafi, which increased the cry for no-fly zone. And 3, that only intervention can stop an imminent genocide. Although these myths were invented by the rebels, it were the major Western news outlets, NGOs, and politicians who spread them worldwide in their attempt to legitimize their just war. Amnesty International, for instance, played a leading role in propagating the black mercenary narrative. The president of the French branch of the organization, Genevieve Garrigos, spoke to France 24 on 22nd February 2011, saying that Amnesty had received information that the Libyan government had sent informed mercenaries to fight against the protesters in order to accelerate those oppressive process. Later, however, she admitted that which have no evidence Gaddafi employed mercenary forces. We have no signs nor evidence to corroborate these rumors. She replaced that Amnesty investigators never found any mercenaries agreeing with their interviewer's characterization from their existence as a legend spread by the mass media. The British House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, in a 2016 report to found that the UK government failed to identify that the threat to civilians was overstated and that the rebels included a significant Islamic element. Despite his rhetoric, the proposition that Muammar Gaddafi would have ordered the massacre of civilians in Benghazi was not supported by the available evidence. The Gaddafi regime has taken towns from the rebels without asking civilians in early February 2011. The disparity between male and female casualties known to the UN investigators in late February suggested that Gaddafi regime forces targeted male combatants in a civilian war that did not indiscriminately attack civilians. Moreover, an Amnesty International investigation in June 2011 could not corroborate allegations of mass human rights violations by Gaddafi regime troops. However, it discovered evidence that rebels in Benghazi made false claims and manufactured evidence, while Muammar Gaddafi certainly threatened violence against those who took up arms against his rule. This did not necessarily translate into a threat to everyone in Benghazi. In short, the scale of the threat to civilians was presented with unjustified certainty. We have seen no evidence that the UK government carried out a proper analysis of the nature of the rebellion in Libya. It could not verify the actual threat to civilians posed by the Gaddafi regime. It selectively took elements of Muammar Gaddafi's rhetoric at face value, and it failed to identify the militant Islamist extremist element in the rebellion. UK strategy was founded on erroneous assumptions and an incomplete understanding of evidence. Wow, wow, wow. What do you got to say about that, folks? There you have it. From the horse's mouth, Libya, just like Iraq in 2003, was invaded on false pretexts. This included the allegation that Gaddafi was bombing his own people, a myth that further stressed the need to implement a no-fly zone on Libyan military aircraft. On February 21st, the BBC claimed that witnesses say warplanes have fired on protesters in the city of Tripoli. Echoing claimed that witnesses say airplanes have fired on protesters in the city of Tripoli. Echoing statements made the oppression by activists and detected Libyan diplomats. Other mass media outlets, such as Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, CNN, and The Telegraph, made similar accusations. At a Department of Defense press conference on 1st of March, however, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates and Admiral Mullen were asked if they had independent confirmation that Gaddafi actually has fired on his own people from the air, to which they both replied they had none. An Amnesty International investigation from June 2011 corroborated that there is no evidence that Gaddafi used helicopters, aircraft, or anti-aircraft machine guns against civilian protesters. Another pretext that triggered NATO operations was the alleged massacre Gaddafi forces were about to inflict on the people of Benghazi. The city had fallen to opposition fighters in February, but when the Security Council was set to vote on establishing a no-fly zone in mid-March, Gaddafi warned that an attack on the rebel stronghold was imminent. As acknowledged by the New York Times, he promised amnesty to those who throw their weapons away, but no mercy or compassion for those who fight. Obama, however, claimed later that month that Gaddafi declared he would show no mercy to his own people, and that if we waited one more day, Benghazi could suffer a massacre that would have reverberated across the region and stained the conscience of the world. He repeated this rhetoric in a joint letter with the British Prime Minister David Cameron and French President Nicolas Sarkozy in April, published in the New York Times, which proclaimed that the bloodbath that he, Gaddafi, had promised to inflict on citizens of the besieged city of Benghazi has been prevented because of our country. Responded immediately. Tens of thousands of lives have been protected. To date, these heads of state are yet to provide evidence that would support the tens of thousands of lives. In fact, prior to the operation to retake Benghazi, Gaddafi recaptured a number of other cities easily or partially without penetrating genocide. In the case of Misrata, for instance, only 3% of the 250 deaths recounted by April were women, which strongly suggests that the most of the deceased were fighters, and that was killing was not an indiscriminate nature. Even the Washington Post company-owned Foreign Policy magazine, along with other mainstream analysts, synchronized the notion that there was going to be a Benghazi massacre. In the conversation between radio host James Corbett of the Corbett Report and Lionel of Lionel Nation, the idea was put forward that regarding the false media stories, the greater the horror, the easier to fake, because the public is reluctant to question horrific stories. Such is the case for the most heinous allegation made against Libyan government troops. On 28 March, Al Jazeera launched a story that Gaddafi used rape as a weapon of war and he distributed Viagra to his soldiers. The story was then picked up by the usual war hawks from the UN ambassador, UN Susan Rice, and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to ICC Chief Prosecutor Luis Moreno Ocampo. The latter went even as far to say that we have information there was a policy to rape in Libya those who were against the government, and that Viagra is a tool of massive rape. Eventually, however, the same Amnesty International report that is quoted above did not find any victim of rape or doctor who knew about somebody being raped, let alone of a policy of mass rape. Similarly, the Human Rights Council inquiry into war crimes in Libya, released in 2012, concluded that although sexual violence occurred in Libya, the Commission did not find evidence to substantiate claims of a widespread or a systematic attack or any overall policy of sexual violence against the civilian population. So, dramatic than accurate. That's what these vultures always like to do. Dramatize everything, but how authentic. The less it is, the more they want you to manifest. That's how my coffee too. So, you have to always examine everything in a broader perspective when it comes to these events. And I will continue on here. Actual war crimes. While Obama and company were crying crocodile tears about alleged atrocities by Gaddafi forces, they failed to notice the very real war crimes penetrated by the insurgents. The true nature of the rebels became especially clear that the Battle of Satir, in which they killed Gaddafi and captured the last stronghold of the Libyan government, not only Reuters and the Associated Press reporters witnessed looting and ransacking of houses, and did an Amnesty International report detail the widespread tortured, especially dark-skinned ex-officials, soldiers, and civilians, at least 12 of whom died in the process. But in the aftermath of the liberation of Sirte, it was also revealed that the insurgents had gone on a killing spree. Human Rights Watch investigators on the ground found 53 decomposing bodies, presumed to be Gaddafi supporters, at an abandoned hotel on 23rd of October. The bloodstains on the grass directly below the bodies, bullet holes visible in the ground, the spent cartridges of AK-47 and FN-1 rifles scattered around the site, and the fact that some of the bodies had their hands tied behind their backs with plastic ties strongly suggests that some, if not all, of the people were shot and killed in the location where they were discovered, the report read. At another site, the investigators saw the badly decomposed bodies of 10 people who, too, had been executed and that were dumped in the water reservoir. At a third site, the investigators found the remains of at least 95 people, although vast majority of them probably died in combat. At least 6 appeared to have been executed at the site with gunshot wounds to the head and body. 2 days later, CBS News correspondent Alan Pezzi reported that nearly 300 bodies, many of them with their hands tied behind their backs and shot in the head, have been collected from across Sirte and buried in a mass grave. There are no names in one graveyard, only numbers. 572 so far and counting. That's because the graves hold the bodies of the alleged mercenaries. Most were killed in the fighting, but local officials freely admit that some were summarily executed. The insurgents' brutal executions, however, were already documented by their own admissions from the very onset of the Libyan crisis. On 18th February, 3 days into the uprising, The Guardian quoted an Al Jazeera interview with political activist Amr Said, who said, "The protesters in al-Baida have been able to seize control of the military air base in the city and have executed 50 African mercenaries and 2 Libyan conspirators. Even in Derna today, a number of conspirators were executed. They were locked up in the holding cells of a police station because they resisted, and some died burning inside the building. This has never been found any credible evidence of foreign African fighters employed by the Libyan government. These African mercenaries were thus killed merely for being sub-Saharan migrants or black Libyans who may or may not have served in the Libyan army. Compare this one event in which revolutionaries, by their own admission, extrajudicially slaughtered more than 50 people to Human Rights Watch estimated of 84 people killed by government forces across the whole country from the day the protests erupted on the 15th of February until the same day, 18th of February. While this latter number appears credible, it was based on telephone interviews with local hospital staff. The contention that they were all peaceful protesters killed simply because they were demanding change and accountability relies solely on the claims made by unnamed protesters and eyewitnesses. With the ruthlessness of the armed insurgency in mind, it is much more likely that at least some died in combat with government troops. So you have to, real shame when you see that. So I'm going to say here, conclusion. Although a number of substantiated war crime allegations targeting the Libyan government turned out to be completely made up, they were nonetheless reported upon without much scrutiny and taken serious for several months by the Western and Gulf mass media, mounting evidence of very war crimes by the NATO-backed insurgents. On the other hand, did not receive saturation coverage and were downplayed and covered up to the extent possible, only to receive proper investigation after the regime change mission was concluded. The ultra-biased reporting influenced both public opinion and other international policymakers in favor of NATO's humanitarian intervention, not only in the days surrounding the implementation of the no-fly zone, but also during the subsequent crucial months of bombardments. Reminiscent of the mainstream coverage in the critical months leading up to the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq in 2003, in addition to the blatant propaganda against the Syrian government today. This again shows how the mass media have become mouthpieces for the continuous cycle of war. Since NATO declared Libya liberated after Gaddafi's murder in October 2011, the country has plunged into chaos. Libya today is a hotbed for Islamist brigades, including ISIS. Rival government and tribes are competing for power, and migrants on their way to Europe are being sold at open slave markets. As Libyan intelligence reports from 2011 obtained by the Washington Times found that NATO weapons being funneled into Libya ended up with al-Qaeda-linked rebels. A Libyan rebel commander in March 2011 admitted that his fighters had ties to al-Qaeda, and the White House was well aware, though concerned, that Qatar was sending weapons to jihadists inside Libya from the beginning on the war onwards. Washington, once again, just like in Syria today or Afghanistan in the 1980s, has clearly teamed up with the very same Islamist terrorist organization again, whom it is supposedly fighting a war on terror. Taking into this account, as well as the fact that there were significant rallies in favor of Gaddafi, and several reports reveal that civilians volunteered to take up arms to defend Syria against the joint NATO rebel operation against the city. The question remains, was this a peaceful uprising for the ideas of democracy and human rights, as a humanitarian interventionist would have us believe? Or were there Arab Spring protests, just like in Syria, used as a pretext to enhance NATO imperialism? That is good questions on that. And this is what they're doing. It's the same old song and dance to benefit the military-industrial complex, plus using Edward Bernays' playbook propaganda. Manipulate people, con them, convince them that it's for their own well-being. That's why during that time I questioned the whole thing immediately. Now I'm not saying I'm lovey-dovey with Gaddafi, but or a fan of his government. But when you observe everything to a bigger picture, let the folks in there take care of their own affairs, rather the United States and NATO intervening, sticking their noses where they don't belong. This is one of the reasons why Benghazi happened. It's called blowback. That's why I considered individuals like former President Barack Obama and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, labeled them as war criminals. Regardless what they are and their partisan party alliance. What happened here was completely unacceptable, and censure it with a passion. Really got to look at this, my friends. Is this a one world order part of the New World Order agenda? Absolutely. This is just part one of this event. So we're going to continue on here for part two of this subject. And this one here is called Gaddafi and NATO, a history of deception. It came out June 4th, same author. As it reads, Muammar Gaddafi was born in Bedul tent near Sodeh in 1942 to a poor family, living through the last years of the Italian colonial rule and Libya's somewhat reluctant monarchy following its independence at the behest of the great powers in 1952. Gaddafi grew up in a time that the country's political unity was still subversive to regional competition between Serenisia, Tripolitania, and Fezzan. Hope I pronounced that correctly. Being a rural Bedouin himself, he abhorred regionalism and developed an ideology embroiled with nationalism and anti-imperialism. Amid a bloodless coup on the 1st September 1969 that overthrew King Idris, the 23-year-old Gaddafi and his fellow free officers rose to power. Unlike many Western-backed Middle East rulers that have large amounts of natural resources at their disposal, the Revolutionary Command Council was willing to put the huge oil's revenues, which skyrocketed after OPEC's 1973 boycott, to the country's internal development. As a result, Libya grew from one of the poorest nations in the world during the 1950s to the country with the highest living standard in Africa. The national expenditures of literacy, healthcare, and education expanded rapidly under Gaddafi, while the government raised minimum wages and provided interest-free loans and subsidies for farming and the construction of houses. By 2009, in a stark contrast to many African nations that are stuck in the Western orbit, life expectancy at birth had risen to 72.3 years. Youth literacy to 99.9%, and infant mortality had dropped to 14 per 1,000 births. A most indicative example of the employment of oil income to national development was a great man-made river GMR project, an impressive irrigation system that solved the problem of water supply through the construction of a large network of pipelines that transports water from the country's southern desert ground reserves to the coastal cities, where most Libyans live. According to a BCC 2006 article, it is impossible not to be impressed with the scale of the project, and the Libyans like to call the eighth wonder of the world, indicative of NATO's war crimes in Libya. The humanitarian interventionists deliberately bombed critical GMR water installations, thereby disrupting the nation's water infrastructure and leaving millions of Libyans without potable water to this day. According to investigative journalist Nasfeed Ahmad, this amounts to a potential genocidal strategy. The more relevant to the story, however, is the fact that Gaddafi was willing to commit his country's resources to the international cause of Pan-Arabism. The new Libyan leader had an unlimited admiration for Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser, and he spoke about combining their strength to deter the imperial powers. Tell President Nasser we made this revolution for him. He can take everything of ours and add to the rest of the Arab world's resources to be used for the battles against Israel and for Arab unity. Regarding the fact that Egypt and Syria had already foregone a short-lived political union from 1958 to 1961, this potential should not be underestimated. His hero died within a year after a coup. However, Egypt's next president, Anwar Sadat, was less concerned with Arab unity. Consequently, Gaddafi became the self-appointed guardian of Nasser's legacy, nurturing the notion of Pan-Arabism as one of the cornerstones of the Libyan revolution. This made him for an obvious target of the oligarchs seeking Western hegemony over the Third World and therefore had to be demonized. Engaging Europe, Yvonne Fletcher and the Libya discotheque bombing. Despite the nationalism of some American and British oil interests in 1973, the Libyan government showed no inclination towards an open confrontation with the West in the first years after the coup. Gradually, however, as Gaddafi openly voiced his support for Palestinian resistance against Zionism, the Irish Republican Army struggled against British rule, and the African National Congress battle against apartheid, the U.S. started accusing Libya of supporting terrorism. It was only after Libya was accused of being directly involved in a series of terrorist attacks in Europe in the 1980s, so that the U.S. successfully managed to isolate the Libyan government from the international community. While the current administration put the Libyan government on its list of state sponsors of terrorism, it was under Reagan that the situation escalated toward confrontation. In August 1981, the U.S. Sixth Fleet shot down 2 Libyan jet fighters over the Gulf of Satara, a territory regarded by Libya as its territorial waters, but which Washington viewed as an international waterway. Although Reagan's anti-Gaddafi rhetoric intensified, all Libyan crude oil's exports to the U.S. were embargoed, and American citizens were prohibited from traveling to Libya. The U.S. remained unsuccessful in aggravating its NATO allies in Europe to jump on the bandwagon. I can say this, my friends, I remember that during the time. I was on my teens, so I will continue on here. That changed when Yvonne Fletcher, a London policewoman, was killed during a small anti-Gaddafi protest in St. James Square on 17th of April 1984. Although nobody was ever convicted, the British government and mass media outlets were quick to ascribe the murder to personnel at the Libyan embassy, located on the first floor at 5 St. James. Ironically, it was a British two-part documentary aired on Channel 4 in 1996, which cites key witnesses, pathologists, gun specialists, audio experts, ex-intelligence officers, and plot insiders that eventually destroyed the official narrative. The document revealed that an anti-Gaddafi terrorist organization named Al-Burhan, which was planning a coup against the Libyan leader, had infiltrated the embassy, and that there were indeed 11 shots fired from there, but that the 12th bullet that killed Fletcher came from somewhere else on the square, and was fired with a different kind of gun. Because the bullet entry angle was 60 degrees from the horizontal, not 15 degrees. 60 degrees from the horizontal, not 15 degrees. What should have been if the bullet originated from the embassy. The shot must have come from a higher building, drawing on too extensive research. The documentary markers unraveled a sinister plot involving Al-Burhan and German gun traffickers, but also the CIA and other Western intelligence agencies, of whom conspired to discredit Gaddafi and pave the way to regime change in Libya. Indeed, a month after the incident, Birkin and others tried to overthrow the Gaddafi government, but the coup attempt was beaten back by the Libyan army. In early 1986, Reagan warned that the U.S. would take additional steps to confront the Libyan government if needed. Not long after that, on 4th April, a bomb explosion at La Belle discotheque in West Berlin, frequented by American servicemen, killed 3 people and injured 200. 2 weeks later, the U.S. bombed Tripoli and Benghazi, claiming that it had irrefutable evidence that Libya was responsible for the discotheque bombing, leaving at least 15 Libyan citizens dead. The main target was the Libyan leader's headquarters. Gaddafi made it out alive, but his 15-month-old adopted daughter was killed in the attack on his residence, and the 2 of his young sons were injured. The man charged without having masterminded the discotheque bombing was Yasser Cherari, a driver at the Libyan embassy in East Berlin at the time. 10 years after the bombing, Cherari, who in the meantime had to move to Lebanon was extradited to German authorities, but a Berlin judge found the evidence presented by the prosecution so weak that he threatened to release Cherari within 3 weeks unless more proof was presented. Exactly on that last day of these 3 weeks, Mujba Eter, one of the perpetrators that provided the operations instructions for the bomb used in the attack, confessed after having made a deal with the German prosecutors in exchange for immunity. He incriminated Cherari. A 1998 documentary aired on German television channel ZDF, however, discovered, although Eder indeed worked for the Libyan embassy in East Berlin in 1986, he paid regular visits to the U.S. Embassy and was most likely a CIA agent. Furthermore, ZDF asserted that members of a professional group of terrorists led by a certain Mahmoud Abu Jabbar were involved in the attack, but had barely been bothered by the prosecution and had lived safely in other countries since the discotheque bombing. ZDF interviewed Abu Jabbar's right-hand man, Mohammed Amari, and his lawyer in Norway as part of the preparation for the documentary. Mary stopped the interview and he was asked what secret service he had been working for, but his lawyer continued the conversation. Was Mary a Mossad agent, ZDF asked. He was a Mossad man, the lawyer answered. Very interesting. Could we say all the world's a stage? Government-sponsored terrorism? Ooh, it goes on and on and on. Mission accomplished, Lockerbie and sanctions. Despite the alleged involvement of the Libyan government in state-sponsored terrorist attacks on European soil, Western European allies remained reluctant to imposing economic sanctions. On 21st April 1988, however, Pan Am Flight 103 from Frankfurt to New York via London exploded over the Scottish town of Lochbury shortly after it took off at London Heathrow. In the late 1991, U.S. and U.K. formally accused 2 Libyan security officials of masterminding the attack, of which all 259 passengers, both of American and British, were killed. What followed was a series of UN Security Council resolutions demanding the extradition of the suspects. When Libya rejected these demands as a violation of its national sovereignty, the Security Council and the U.S. Congress both imposed severe sanctions on Libya. After many countries worldwide started to oppose these sanctions, and the Organization of African Unity in 1998 announced that its members would no longer enforce the UN sanctions unless America and Britain agreed to hold trial of the Lochbury suspects in a neutral country. The U.S., UK, and Libya came to agreement to hold a trial in Hague in the Netherlands. The verdict acquitted 1 of the 2 suspects, but found the other, Abdel Basset al-Mohammed al-Maghari, guilty. It turned out that one of the key prosecution witnesses at al-Maghari's trial, a Maltese shopkeeper who identified al-Maghari as buying clothes from him that were found in a suitcase which carried the bomb, was paid $2 million by the the U.S. Department of Justice. The shopkeeper also failed several times to identify al-Maghrabi, only recognizing him after seeing his photo in a magazine being shown in the same photo in court. In addition, a chief Scottish investigator declared in 2005 that the main piece of evidence, the bomb timer, had been planted at this crime scene by CIA agent. In 2007, the expert who has analyzed the bomb timer for the court admitted that he had lied at the trial, had manufactured the timer himself, and had given it to a Lockbury investigator. Moreover, the fragment he identified was never tested for residue of explosives, although it was only evidence of possible Libyan involvement. Finally, a London Heathrow Airport security guard revealed that Pan Am's luggage area had been broken into 17 hours before the flight, which suggests that the bomb was planted at Heathrow, not by al-Maghrabi in Malta, from where it would have to bypass the security systems of 2 additional airports, and in total would have traveled on 3 different planes before exploding. There are several theories about who exactly was responsible for the terrible crime. Some put forward circumstantial evidence the bombing was a retaliatory attack by Iran and the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. General command in the reaction to the shooting down of an equally large Iranian plane over the Persian Gulf by a U.S. airship a couple of months earlier. Others suspect CIA and for Assad involvement, but many are certain of one thing. Al-Maghrabi was innocent and Libya was not responsible. This includes Hans Kulcher, an Austrian professor who was appointed by the UN as an international observer at the trial in Hague, who called the trial a spectacular miscarriage of justice. Remember, he said, she said is irrelevant. And evidence you have to follow through to the T. Reconciliation and betrayal. From the 1990s onward, reconciliation gradually gained the upper hand over animosity. Libya suffered badly under the Washington-led isolation and therefore willing to make concessions. After the Libyan government in 1999 agreed to hand over 2 Lockbury suspects and concurred with paying compensation to the relatives of Yvonne Fletcher and the victims, or UTA Flight 722, a French airliner down in a similar manner as Pan Am Flight 103 of 1989, of which Libya was also, in all likelihood, falsely accused. The U.S. acquiesced to the suspension of the UN sanctions in exchange for Libya paying compensation to the Lockbury victims as well, but not accepting responsibility and agreeing to give up its weapons of mass destruction program. The UN sanctions were officially lifted in 2003, and the U.S. promised to suspend its own sanctions, most of which were lifted in 2004. Finally, during a 2006 trip to the country, Congressman Tom Lantos met with Gaddafi and announced that Libya had been removed from the U.S. list of sponsors of terrorism. Mutual distrust lingered on, however, although isolation was also in official terms, bilateral relations remained cumbersome. Clear from a statement he made in 1999, Gaddafi remained hostile to the dominant American worldview. America, unfortunately, treated us if the world was the way it used to be before the fall of the Soviet Union. Some analysts call this new colonialism, but colonialism is colonialism, and is always unjust. It is how we were treated by the Italians, Algeria by the French, India by the British. This is imperialism, and we seem to be entering a new imperialist era. The cause of our conflict with America is not that we attacked them. We never attacked an American target. America started the aggression against us right here in the Gulf of Satir. When we defended ourselves, they attacked us in these very tents. We were bombed by missiles in our own territorial waters. In 1986, our own children were killed. No one can bring back my daughter back to me. Then Lockerbie came along. Now we should like this chain of events to be over, but America does not want to turn the page. We shall, however, show courage and be patient, and America will be the loser. Gaddafi's reservations about reconciliation. He often appeared to show regret for some of the compromises he made, for which Libya received very little in return, especially giving up his WMD program as a deterrent to Western aggression. Were likely not unfounded. In a 2007 interview, retired four-star General U.S. General Wesley Clark revealed that several Mideastern countries, including Libya, were already on the Pentagon's imperialist drawing board in the immediate wake of 9/11. General Clark, came back to see him, and a general to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it is worse than that." He reached over his desk and picked up a paper. He said, "I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today. This is a memo that describes how we are going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran. There's a video on that too, folks. Flash forward to 2011 with the adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 1973 and 1970 to 1973. In March, NATO embarked on a 7-month-long military adventure under the guise of protecting civilians, leaving behind a trail of destruction with Satay back to the Stone Ages. After Operation Unified Protector had officially come to an end on 31st October 2011, NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen concluded that we have carried out this operation very carefully, without confirmed civilian casualties. And NATO spokesperson Anna Longescu claimed that no target was approved or attacked if we had any evidence for reason to believe that civilians were at risk. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, too, rejected claims that NATO has exceeded its mandate, asserting that Security Council Resolution 1973, I believe, was strictly enforced within the mandate. That is categorically false and substantiated even by the most pro-interventionist institutions that investigated NATO's military campaign in retrospect. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, New York Times have all implied documented NATO airstrikes in which, if not deliberately, at least knowing full well the likelihood of collateral damage, numerous civilians were killed. A report published by Middle Eastern human rights groups after a fact-finding mission to Libya even implicated NATO in war crimes, referring to a NATO attack on 15 September, which resulted in the death of 57 to 59 individuals, of whom approximately 47 were civilians. The report described how 2 jeeps carrying combatants were destroyed by NATO air fire in Satay, after which a crowd of civilians flocked to the scene and attempt to rescue survivors and retrieve the dead. 5 minutes later, the third missile targeted the exclusively civilian crowd, killing 47 of them. NATO's operational media update for 15 September noted the destruction of 2 armed vehicles, but made no mention of the swaths of civilians had just slaughtered. Like I said, my friends, more imperialism at its finest, more of trusting government, whether it's foreign or domestic. It's been deceived, been deprived. and the people suffered the most. And we'll go on here. Gaddafi's death. We came, we saw, he died. The above mentioned 15 September attack does not only illustrate the ruthlessness of NATO's military campaign, it also signals its importance as a necessary accessory to the advance of the rebel fighters, especially in the final battle of the war in Sirte. Whereas the insurgents were allowed to freely move tanks into place to surround and enter the last Gaddafi stronghold, any attempt by government forces to move as much as a jeep was met with NATO air fire. So when a convoy of 75 vehicles leaving the scene of the battle was intercepted and attacked by U.S. Predator drone and French jets on the morning of 20th October, NATO did not elaborate on how the convoy was posing a threat of the local population. Although an intelligence breakthrough allowed NATO forces to pinpoint Gaddafi's location a week prior to the attack, according to the Telegraph. The military alliance supposedly did not know the Libyan leader was in one of the convoy's trucks fleeing Sirte. The Telegraph had previously already reported that the SAS commandos, British Special Forces, dressed in Arab civilian clothing and wearing the same weapons as the rebels, were spearheading the hunt for Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, as NATO had repeatedly bombed Gaddafi compound during the war, and as we have seen above, before the war too, as the U.S. government internally discussed covert action to assassinate Gaddafi as early as 1969, according to the memoirs of Henry Kissinger. Yes, my warmongering hero. Yay. Criminal scumbag that he is. This means that U.S. Western involvement in Gaddafi's brutal murder in the streets of Sirte is at least plausible. Indeed, according to Mahmoud Jibril, the interim prime minister of the rebel-led National Transition Council, it was a foreign agent who mixed with the revolutionary brigades to kill Gaddafi. Either way, the U.S. Warhawk, Western Warhawks probably did not mourn the death of the Libyan leader, judging from then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's first reaction to the death of Gaddafi, followed by an arrogant laugh. She concluded, "We came, we saw, he died." Yes, these bloodthirsty scumbags want us to use everyone to so-called benefit them, not the people of Libya. When will you folks or your associates within your environment going to wake up to the bigger picture? Why be worried about getting distracted of garbage and fluff? When we going to tell them, never again, stop imperialism? When are we going to tell the government of the world to stick it? This is why, my friends, it has to end. I support a republic, never an empire. Everyone gets these excuses. Neocons, neolibs, neoquacks. Try to defend it. If you remember those past presidential debates, all those Trump haters now that supported Hillary were speaking like that, and he still loved her. So learn to think for yourselves instead of being a bunch of her-conformed hypocrites. Start calling these individuals out, including Hillary, saying she's a war-mongering demonade. Something to contemplate over, my friends. Yeah, I was just informed that Adam West, that played Batman in the 60s, has passed away at 88 years old. Wow. Well, may his soul be forever free. Remember watching some of his stuff when I was a kid. Wow. Well, like I said, my friends, live once, value it, and try to achieve many things possible, including inspiring others to better themselves. So we're going to hit the final chapter or part of this title subject, the humanitarian destruction of Libya, which is part 3, the war in Africa. As it reads here, by the same author as well, Bas Spalet. Although 40 years in power, Muammar Gaddafi first addressed the UN General Assembly in September 2009, reminiscent of Fidel Castro's speech to the body in 1960. He went over allotted times of 15 minutes and talked over for an hour and a half. He advocated for radical change in the inner workings of the UN and said that the General Assembly should adopt a binding resolution that will put it above the authority of the Security Council. The latter, according to Gaddafi, had failed to prevent 65 wars since its inception and is unjust and undemocratic because the 5 permanent members have all the actual power. If the General Assembly were to be, which would be the most powerful body, however, all nations would be equal footing, he proclaimed, which would prevent future conflict. He ascribed similar bias to the International Criminal Court and the International Atomic Energy Agency as they, just like the Security Council, are used to demonize enemies of the global powers, while their own crimes of those of their allies go largely unnoticed. He went on to dismiss Washington's war against Iraq, advocated for a one-state solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and urged the General Assembly to launch investigations into the murder of Patrice Lumumba, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and the massacres of the Israeli army and their allies committed against the Palestinians in the Lebanese refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila in 1982 and in Gaza in 2008. Well, he wasn't being biased, right? The picture of the Colonel Gaddafi that emerges seems to be somewhat in conflict with that put forward by the mass media. Rather than just another brutal, power-hungry dictator who seems to be interested in only killing his own people, it looks like he has some interesting ideas, to say at the least. Perhaps it might be useful to step away from the simplified and rhetoric-laden label of dictator for a moment and keep a deeper look into Gaddafi's ideas and why they pose such a great danger to the global power elite. In his Green Book, published in 1975, Gaddafi laid out his idea of a stateless society, which he called Jamahiriya, a country directly governed by its citizens without intervention from representative bodies. According to the Green Book, states that rely on representation are inherently repressive because individuals must surrender their own personal sovereignty to the advantage of others. It sounds like the founding. Like you read that stuff from the founding fathers of the United States. With emphasis on the consultation and equality, Gaddafi therefore called into life a different political model for Libya based on a direct democracy. Although establishment of popular Congress and popular committees representing the legislative and executive branches respectively, Gaddafi's political system was constructed from the bottom up rather than the top down. Professor Dirk van der Waal scrutinized Gaddafi's notion of a popular rule in his book, A History of Modern Libya. However, the fact that political parties outside the system designed by Gaddafi were practically forbidden and Libyan opposition movements were often persecuted. Read page 103, 134, and 143 to 50 of that book. The popular committees had zero power in several areas, including foreign policy, intelligence, the army, the police, and country's budget and the petroleum sector, as well as the fact that the government abolished or took over numerous private businesses and gradually implemented a virtually unsupervised revolutionary court system, all the point to actual authoritarian nature of the central government. Van der Waal concluded that the bifurcation between the Jamahiriya's formal and informal mechanisms of control and political power accentuate the limited institutional control Libyan citizens have had over their country's ruler and his actions. In effect, unless the country's leadership clearly approves, there is no public control or accountability provided. within the non-formal institutions of the country's security organizations. The revolutionary leadership makes all the decisions and has no accountability to anyone. Although Van der Waal is very critical of Gaddafi's rule throughout his book, he acknowledged that NATO's Operations Unified Protector became a sine qua non for the rebels just to be able to maintain their positions, and that it was clear that greater and more decisive NATO intervention would be needed to defeat the loyalist side. This means rather than the civil war between Libyans, this is the war between Gaddafi on the one hand, who exercised the actual power on the international domain, and NATO on the other, which was a necessary component in Gaddafi's toppling. The question is, what was it about? War on African independence and prosperity. From the moment he rose to power, Gaddafi's anti-imperialism did not only go hand in glove with an urge to national unity, but need to form a multilateral regional bloc as well. As Nasser died in 1970, Gaddafi became one of the leading voices for unity under the banner of, or pan-Arabism, as only they could, the Arab world from a front against Israel and the West. After a range of failed agreements of political union with Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, Morocco, and Algeria during the 1970s and 80s, however, Gaddafi grew increasingly frustrated over the impotence of the Arab world to make the Arab League to a viable organization. As a result, Gaddafi reorientated to Africa, declaring in March 1999, "I have no time to lose talking with Arabs. I now talk of Pan-Africanism and African unity." A couple months later, he reverberated the words of his new motto, Kahana's Kwam Nkrumah, often considered one of the chief ideologies of modern Pan-Africanism, calling the historic solution for the African continent, the United States of Africa. Africa in a structural state of underdevelopment. Recent studies have shown that for every dollar of aid that developing countries receive, they lose 24 in net outflows. In other words, rich countries are not developing poor countries. Poor countries are developing rich ones. Hence, it would be an understatement to posit that the current situation maintained the status quo, rather than the global inequality gap has significantly worsened in post-colonial times under the regimes of the IMF, World Bank, and UN. Indeed, the distance between the richest and poorest countries was already about 35 to 1 in 1950, but further rose to a staggering 80 to 1 in 1999. Gaddafi understood the potential of an African free of the neo-colonial grip of Western powers. In 2005, he stated that there was an attempt to promote proposals aimed at extending aid for Africa, but when aid is linked to humiliating conditions, we don't want humiliation. If aid is conditional and leads to compromises, we don't need it. There are the ones who need Africa. They need its wealth. 50% of the world's gold reserves are in Africa. A quarter of the world's uranium resources are in Africa. And 9% of the world's diamonds are in Africa. Africa is rich in unexploited natural resources, but we were and still are forced to sell these resources cheaply to get hard currency, and this must stop. So it's like he stopped playing. So right there, he's tired of playing ball. All right. Now we'll continue on here. Gaddafi was not the first one to understand this. In the second half of the 20th century, out of the dialectical relationship between the centuries-old philosophy idea of Pan-Africanism and the emerging trend of regional economic integration worldwide, there grew the idea that Africa, too, could only thrive through cooperation, unity, and integration. The search for unity began with the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963. But over the years, the OAU only proved to be mildly successful in its objectives. Nevertheless, around the change of the millennium, there was an emerging pattern of independence and collaboration in Africa that might have been able to facilitate increased African self-determination, thereby putting the continent on a path in which could gradually thrown off the chains of structural underdevelopment. Although not in totality, these developments were in large parts thanks to Libya and specifically Gaddafi. The elimination of one man, therefore, was sufficient to disrupt the path towards African independence, at least in the short run. So he wants to see that continent be self-contained instead of outside interference, which are considered distractions. And I can understand that. And it says here, a United States of Africa and the roadmap to a pan-African currency. In the first 2 decades after the 1969 coup, while still being more concerned with Arab rather than African unity, Libya sought to undermine African governments and found unobjectionable and provide support to countries of its liking. In contrast, the 1990s saw a gradual shift towards rapprochement with neighboring countries and the rest of Africa, as the country's foreign policy shifted towards promoting regional cohesion via more constructive participation in multilateral arrangements and mediation in African conflicts, in addition to further bolster its image of the continent, just like it dedicated large swaths of its oil revenues to pan-Arabism. The Libyan government started to pump tens of billions of dollars in aid and investments in Africa. As a successful vanguard of Gaddafi's reorientation to Africa, he in 1998 convened a meeting of Sahel and Saharan states in Tripoli, as a result of which a new regional organization was born. The Community of Sahel and Saharan States, CENSAD, most notably, aside from promoting regional development initiatives, the organization opposed foreign interference in African judicial and condemned outside forces seeking pretexts for establishing a lasting establishment on the continent. In 2007, CENSAD issued a statement from its Tripoli headquarters categorically rejecting U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM, and any other foreign military presence in its member states. This was very troubling for the U.S.'s image in Africa, as CENSAD membership by then comprised roughly half of Africa's territory and population. It should be noted, finally, that the 2011 war in Libya was AFRICOM's first official war, and with the fierce adversary out of the way, its military exercise and overall influence on the continent since 2012 has skyrocketed. The presence of U.S. commandos in Africa jumped from 3%, all of American troops deployed overseas in 2010, to 70% in 2016, and by 2017, the U.S. military was carrying out nearly 100 missions at any given time on the continent. In other words, Africa has become an open playfield for the U.S. Gaddafi's gradual conversion to Pan-Africanism culminated into his desire for a borderless United States of Africa that is a single continent ruled by a single government, a united defense force, and one foreign trade policy, which he proclaimed at an extraordinary summit of the OAU in Sirte on 9 September 1999. The summit produced what is now known as the Sirte Declaration, that document that announced the birth of the African Union, or AU, a comprising of all African nations which eventually came to existence into 2002, thereby replacing the more inefficient OAU. Gaddafi's role in these developments are clear from the Article 7 of the Sirte Declaration, which states, "In our deliberations, we have inspired by the most important proposals submitted by Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, leader of the great al-Fatah Libyan revolution, and particularly by his vision for a strong and united Africa, capable of meeting global challenges and shouldering its responsibility to harness the human and natural resources of the continent in order to improve the living conditions of its people. Better things must see their lives better." Now I'll continue on here. So far, the AU, of course, has fallen far short of becoming a United States of Africa as envisioned by Gaddafi. Centralization in Europe, however, only started to put in motion after a fierce debate in the 1940s and 50s between intergovernmentalists and supranationalists who respectively abhorred and welcomed the creation of a centralized body with its own sovereign powers, was won by the latter with the help of the CIA and transatlanticist elite organizations such as the Bilderberg Group. After coming into existence of a single market in 1957, the European Union gradually began to take shape and step by step has become more and more like the United States of Europe, culminating in what is often regarded as the centerpiece of European integration, the creation of a European Central Bank, and the euro as a common currency. As we have seen above, Africa, under the leadership of Gaddafi, was moving in a similar direction with the emergence of supranational organizations like the OAU, CENSOD, and AU. Furthermore, the continent was gradually moving towards monetary integration as well. The Abdul Treaty of 1991 established the African Economic Community and outlined 6 stages for achieving a single monetary zone for Africa by 2028. The final stage involved the creation of an African Central Bank, an African Economic and Monetary Union, and a African Common Currency. The 1999 declaration, spearheaded by Gaddafi, vowed to speed up this process. In addition, plans were underway to create an African Monetary Fund that would only be open for African nations and would thus be able to directly challenge colonial institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Most importantly, however, since the reorientation to Africa, Gaddafi repeatedly urged the establishment of a single African currency. Lastly, in February 2009, when he was elected chairman of the AU. It's interesting. So the whole thing in this area there, he wants to unite Africa without any Club of Rome incentives. That's how I'm seeing it by that paragraph. So it could go either way. So that's how I'm observing this. Wants to do it, unite them without any foreign outside intervention. And I will continue on here. To fully understand the significance of Gaddafi's money endeavor, some background is needed. Under the Bretton Woods system negotiated in the final days of the Second World War, the U.S. dollar became the backbone of the world monetary system, convertible to gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce, with all other currencies pegged to it. As the dollar grew weaker in the ensuing decades, many nations, including Germany and France, started to demand gold for their dollars. However, causing the U.S. gold reserves to plunge, President Nixon then abandoned the Bretton Woods system, and after the Western oligarchs had engineered the 1973 OPEC oil crisis, the petrodollar became into existence as a replacement of the gold standard. That's during the Nixon administration, 1971, and Arthur Burns was the federal chairman of the Federal Reserve. Something to look at. In this system, Saudi Arabia, then the largest OPEC oil exporter, pledged to price of all its future oil sales in dollars and recycle its increased revenue through alliance-assist banking institutions. Most petroleum exporting nations followed suit and started to trade their oil for dollars as well, thereby maintaining the dollar as the world reserve currency, but it's backed up by oil instead of gold. In 2000, Iraq, which holds the world's second-largest oil reserve after Saudi Arabia, made the political decision to dump the petrodollar and consequently start to export almost all of its oil in euros. The invasion and regime change quickly followed. In January 2017, Iran announced that it would stop using the dollar as its currency for its exports, the main commodity of which is oil. And blatantly obvious plans of toppling the Iranian government are well underway. Gaddafi not only wanted to ditch the dollar for another currency as well, he wanted to create a new one, using Libya's own 444 tons of gold, a relatively large amount regarding its fairly small population, contrary to the dollar, which most part made out of thin air by private banking cartels. The gold dinar would be steady and reliable as would be made from gold, precious metals, of which Africa has plenty in reserves. Moreover, if a future situation oil-rich African and Middle Eastern countries would jump on the bandwagon and accept only gold in exchange for the oil, as well as other resources to petrodollar, would be replaced by the petro-gold system. The global economy then would be built on the backbone of two commodities of which Western countries possess less than the global South. This would be enable the latter to throw of the neo-colonial chains of structural enslavement and poverty, and would in likelihood cause the current global power structure to collapse. So because other countries, Iraq and now Iran, Iraq dumped the dollar, petrodollar, and look what happened to them. And now everyone's focusing on Iran because I could say they dumped the petrodollar. So let's go attack them and say they're evil terrorists. Woo! Something to really look at, my friends, right? So don't believe the hype and lies, but examine the facts. It is obvious that the banksters who concurrently control the global money supply through their shares in central banks cannot afford to let this unfold. 3 events, all happening in the first 2 months of the conflict, signal the banksters' role in the war. First, the Obama administration froze a $30 billion in Libyan government assets on 28th of February, according then Under Secretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence David Cohen. This $30 billion comprised the total of the assets of the Libyan government, the Libyan Investment Authority, and its 100% state-owned central bank. Interestingly, part of this money was reportedly earmarked for the Libyan contribution to the creation of the African Investment Bank, the African Monetary Fund, and the African Central Bank. Second, by the end of March, the rebels in Benghazi had created their own central bank, while it was still all but clear if they would succeed in toppling Gaddafi. This left even mainstream analysts puzzled. I have never heard of a central bank being created in just a matter of weeks out of a popular uprising, noted Robert Renzel in Economic Policy Journal. This suggests we have a bit more than a ragtag bunch of rebels running around, and that there are some pretty sophisticated influences. Finally, a leaked email from early April between Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and her confidential advisor, Sid Blumenthal, confirms the remaining threats of Gaddafi's plan, despite the freezing of Libyan assets. In the email titled France Inclined Gaddafi's Goal, Blumenthal stated, Gaddafi governments hold 143 tons of gold and a similar amount of silver. During late March 2011, these stocks were moved to Sabah, which is southwest and direct of the Libyan border in Nigeria and Chad, taken from the vaults of the Libyan Central Bank in Tripoli. This gold was accumulated prior to the current rebellion and was intended to be used to establish a Pan-African currency based on the Libyan golden dinar. This plan was designed to provide the Francophone African countries with an alternate to the French franc. The French aspect was, of course, only the tip of the iceberg. According to Professor Maximilien Forte, NATO's war in Libya sought to disrupt an emerging pattern of independence and a network of collaboration within Africa that would facilitate increased African self-reliance. Gaddafi stood at the forefront of these developments since the turn of the millennium, and his plan to create a gold-backed African currency might have been the final catalyst to rendering these developments irreversible. With the fierce advocate of Pan-Africanism out of the way, it remains to be seen if internal divisions will be overcome or not. However, as of June 2015, the African Union renewed talks on the implementation of a pan-continental currency and an African monetary fund, but it's still unclear whether foreign help is going to be kept out of whether newly formed Pan-African institutions will be used to demand their fair profits for Africa's abundant natural resources like Gaddafi envisioned. We have to see about that. Contemplating another direction, I would like to finish a normative remark because we threaten to fall into a false dilemma here. Globalism, as we know today, was set in motion in the West. Some 500 years ago, Europe rapidly expanded overseas and soon colonized the whole world. It then went on to plunder the global South for several centuries by exploiting its natural resources as well as its human labor through slavery, thereby appropriating a huge evidence in internal development. After decolonization, however, structures that maintain global inequality remained in place through centralized regimes, politically through the UN and NATO, but also through more obscure institutions like the Trilateral Commission and the Council of Foreign Relations, and economically through the dollar as the world reserve currency, as well as the IMF and World Bank. These centralized regimes were not only suppressed the global south, however, they limited everyone's freedom, moved sovereignty even further away from the individual, and in essence enslaved humanity. Is it an alternative centralization of power, i.e., a United States of Africa with a single government and monopolized currency, then not an imitation of the same system of repression that the Europeans and Americans imposed on Africa? If successful, would it not impose an equally tyrannical system, but with a different face? As Franz Fanon, a Martinique-born Caribbean revolutionary who, like Gaddafi, was concerned with the constructive African independence, wrote in 1961 in the conclusion of the most famous works, Las Dames de la Terre, or The Wretched of the Earth. Comrades, the European game is definitely over. We must find something else. We can do everything today, provided that we don't imitate Europe, provided that we won't be obsessed with overtaking Europe. Let us decide not to imitate Europe. Let us mobile our muscles and brains in another direction. 2 centuries ago, a former European colony decided to overtake Europe. She succeeded so well is that the United States of America has become the monster, which the defects, the diseases, and inhumanity of Europe have reached a despicable dimension. Comrades, don't we have something else to do than to work the creation of a third Europe? Good point there. As citizen of Western Europe, where external imperialism is absent, I recognize that this is of good easier said than done. It is much easier to try and unthink the centralized regimes in the West because of its population. In contrast to Africans, has not faced persistent attacks from power-hungry imperial powers over the last couple of centuries, with Western institutions of hegemony over the global South still in place with the consent of its citizens. Alternative centralized regimes that try to challenge Western dominance will remain tempting and might often appear as the only path towards real independence, when in fact they inevitably are not, as absolute power will always be corrupted. As a process of decentralization, then, will have to unfold simultaneously in rich and in poor countries, as modern technologies have opened up unprecedented capabilities and worldwide communication have rendered ideas borderless. However, I'm confident that it will. Nicely done there, Mr. Spillett. The whole thing is they want everything to be self-contained. So there's a political, spiritual warfare even happening in Africa. They still want to provide that particular legacy for Gaddafi. Like him or not. He has some very good points. He sees things in the bigger picture. So I have to respect that. I'm tired of seeing my tax dollars go and intervene in these other countries and continents. It's completely unacceptable. We're going to let that be, let them decide their own destiny, like we need to do as freedom, love, and sovereign thinking individuals. They may have different direction, but they want to be self-contained. So an interesting thing was when that song Africa Unite by Bob Marley, Peace and Harmony. Is it going to be perfect if this fulfills? Absolutely not. It's going to be, remember, it's government. It's run by human beings. But nowhere in the world should never be galvanized or be victims of tyranny. Let Africa, the continent, do their thing. Resolve their problems. Let them be self-contained. Because there'll be prosperity for them. And they can have better relations than we have right now. Get rid of these foreign entities, like in the United States. Kick them off the map. Use their facilities like CFR, the IMF, World Bank, United Nations. They're outhouses. shred them to oblivion so we can seek true peace, security, spiritual prosperity. That's in Africa, but the world. So that is all, my friends. Yeah, it's like a pretty bit long, so this is how it goes. I'd like to thank everyone for listening to this show. Plus, feel free to download and share throughout your social media networks. If you have any questions, comments, or you want to send me something that's interesting, I may want to check out. Whatever you do, please address your correspondences with decorum. You keep me on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, Tumblr, YouTube, Freedoms Network, Scene.life, Minds.com, FutureNet.club, and Patreon.com, which is /local30 if you want to donate money and all that too. In addition, you can email me at LookieLuck3, which is LookieLuck, the number 3 at gmail.com, or the encrypted ones, fans out there, LookieLuck03. That's number 03, and that's all together at protonmail.com. Woo! All right, another day, my friends. I got a couple more errands I got to do, but that is it. Once again, thank you for your time. Plus, always remember that demoniac resistance is healthy for the soul and can liberate humanity. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Keep on spreading the love, and may your guardian spirits be with you.